Margaret Thompson adjusted her reading glasses and peered through the lace curtains of her small cottage. At 90 years old, she had seen many changes in her quiet neighborhood, but nothing quite like what had happened over the past month. The peaceful street where she had lived for 30 years was now regularly disturbed by the roar of motorcycle engines and the crude laughter of young men who seemed to have no respect for anyone. The trouble had started when a new motorcycle club decided to use the empty lot across from her house as their regular meeting spot. Every evening around 6 o'clock, they would arrive in groups of 8 to 12, their leather jackets gleaming and their bikes thundering loud enough to shake the windows of nearby homes. Margaret had initially tried to ignore them, thinking they would eventually move on to somewhere else. But as days turned into weeks, their behavior grew worse. They would play loud music late into the night, leaving beer bottles scattered across the lot and shouting profanities that made Margaret wince. She had served 25 years in the Army as a nurse, treating wounded soldiers and working in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. She had earned the respect of colonels and generals alike during her service, but these young men seemed to view her as nothing more than an easy target. The harassment began small. At first, they would simply rev their engines extra loud when they saw her in her garden or collecting mail. Then came the crude comments shouted across the street when she walked to the local grocery store. Margaret tried to maintain her dignity, walking with the same straight posture she had learned during her military training. But inside she felt increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Last Tuesday evening had been the worst incident yet. Margaret had been watering her prized rose bushes when 3 of the bikers approached her fence. The leader, a man in his 30s with multiple tattoos covering his arms, had deliberately thrown an empty beer can into her flower bed. When she politely asked him to pick it up, he had laughed and made several inappropriate comments about her age and appearance. His friends had joined in, making her feel humiliated and powerless. That night, Margaret had sat in her favorite armchair, the one her late husband Harold had bought for her 50th birthday, and wondered what she should do. She'd contacted the local police twice, but they explained that unless the bikers committed an actual crime on her property, there was little they could do about noise complaints or verbal harassment. The officers had been sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful, suggesting she might consider moving to a senior living facility where she would feel safer. The suggestion had made Margaret angry. This was her home, the place where she and Harold had built their life together after her retirement from the military. Every room held precious memories, from the kitchen where they had shared countless meals to the small den where Harold had taught their grandchildren to play chess. She had no intention of being driven from her own home by a group of bullies, no matter how intimidating they seemed. Margaret pulled out an old photo album and looked at pictures from her Army days. There she was in her crisp uniform, standing alongside fellow nurses and doctors at military bases around the world. She remembered the challenges she had faced during her service, the times when she had to stand up to difficult patients or demanding superior officers. She had never backed down from a fight when she knew she was right, and she was not about to start now. As she turned the pages, Margaret's eyes fell on a particular photograph that made her smile. It showed her receiving a commendation from a general whose name most civilians would not recognize, but whose reputation in military circles was legendary. She remembered that day clearly, how proud she had felt to be acknowledged for her dedication and service. More importantly, she remembered the connections she had made during her 25 years in uniform, the friendships that had lasted long after retirement. Margaret closed the album and walked to her small desk in the corner of the living room. She pulled out an old address book, its pages yellowed with age but still containing some very important phone numbers. Her fingers traced down the familiar names until she found exactly what she was looking for. Tomorrow, she decided, it was time to make a phone call that would remind these young men that respect is not something you lose simply because you grow old. The next morning dawned bright and clear, and Margaret felt more determined than ever. She had spent her entire adult life serving her country and helping others, and she was not about to let a group of motorcycle club members destroy the peace of her golden years. As she prepared her breakfast and planned her day, Margaret could hear the familiar sound of engines starting up across the street. Soon she knew it would be time to show these bullies that they had picked the wrong person to intimidate. Margaret spent the morning organizing her thoughts and gathering her courage. She had always been a methodical person, a trait that had served her well during her military career when dealing with complex medical situations under pressure. Now she applied that same careful planning to her current problem. She reviewed the phone number she had found in her address book, checking it against an old Christmas card to make sure it was still current. Around noon, she made herself a cup of tea and sat down at her kitchen table with the cordless phone. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the anticipation of what was to come. The number belonged to Colonel James Morrison, retired, who had been her commanding officer during her final assignment at Fort Bragg. More importantly, James was now the father of Captain Sarah Morrison, who currently served as the commanding officer of the local Army National Guard unit, stationed just 40 miles away. Margaret dialed the number and waited as it rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Morrison Residence, this is Jim speaking." The voice was older now, but still carried the authoritative tone that had once commanded respect from hundreds of soldiers. "Colonel Morrison, this is Margaret Thompson. I served under you at Fort Bragg from 1983 to 1987, she said, her voice steady and professional despite her nervousness. There was a pause. Then the warmth in his voice was unmistakable. "Margaret, my goodness, it has been years. How are you doing?" "I remember you well. One of the finest nurses I ever had the privilege of working with. What can I do for you?" Margaret explained her situation carefully, describing the motorcycle club's behavior and the escalating harassment she had been experiencing. She was careful not to exaggerate or sound like a complaining old woman, instead presenting the facts as she would have reported them during a military briefing. Colonel Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making sympathetic sounds that told her he understood exactly what she was dealing with. "Margaret, this is completely unacceptable," he said when she finished. "You served your country with distinction for 25 years and no veteran should have to endure this kind of treatment. I think I can help you with this situation. My daughter Sarah is commanding the National Guard unit over in Millfield. She has some very good people under her command, and I believe some of them live in your area." He went on to explain that several members of Sarah's unit were former Marines and Army personnel who had continued their service in the National Guard after completing their active duty tours. Many of them rode motorcycles themselves and were familiar with the local riding community. More importantly, they understood the value of respect and the importance of looking out for fellow veterans. "I'm going to call Sarah this afternoon and explain your situation," Colonel Morrison continued. "I think she'll be very interested in hearing about this. In the meantime, I want you to document everything these troublemakers do. Write down times, dates, and descriptions of their behavior. If this escalates any further, we'll need that information." After ending the call, Margaret felt a sense of relief she had not experienced in weeks. She was not alone in this fight, and help was coming from people who understood the meaning of honor and service. She spent the rest of the afternoon following the colonel's advice, creating a detailed log of the motorcycle club's activities and their impact on the neighborhood. That evening, as the bikers gathered once again in the lot across the street, Margaret noticed their behavior was particularly rowdy. They had apparently been drinking earlier in the day, and their voices carried clearly across the street as they made crude jokes and played music loud enough to be heard 3 blocks away. One of them noticed her watching from her window and made an obscene gesture in her direction, which his friends found hilarious. Margaret simply smiled and waved back politely, a gesture that seemed to confuse them. She was no longer the frightened old woman they thought they were terrorizing. Tomorrow would bring new developments, and she had a feeling these young men were about to learn a lesson about respect that they would never forget. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret felt more optimistic than she had in weeks. Her military training had taught her that every problem had a solution, and every bully could be defeated with the right strategy and the right allies. She had spent her career helping others, and now it was her turn to receive help from the military family that never truly forgets its own. The phone call had been just the beginning. Soon these motorcycle club members would discover that Margaret Thompson was not just a lonely old woman living by herself. She was a United States Army veteran with connections that reached far beyond what they could imagine, and she was about to remind them that some fights are worth having. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that made Margaret's day considerably brighter. Captain Sarah Morrison's voice was crisp and professional, but warmed with genuine concern as she introduced herself and explained that her father had briefed her on Margaret's situation. "Mrs. Thompson, "I want you to know that what you're experiencing is completely unacceptable," Captain Morrison said. "My father spoke very highly of your service record, and I have nothing but respect for what you contributed to our military. I've been thinking about your situation, and I believe I have a solution that might interest you." Captain Morrison went on to explain that several members of her National Guard unit lived in Margaret's area and were also motorcycle enthusiasts. These were disciplined, respectful servicemen and women who rode high-quality bikes and understood the importance of being good neighbors and positive representatives of the riding community. Many of them had expressed frustration with the negative image that clubs like the one harassing Margaret gave to all motorcycle riders. "I'm organizing what we're calling a community relations ride for this Saturday," the captain continued. "About 15 of my people will be participating, all in proper riding gear and flying American flags from their bikes. We're planning to visit several local veterans in the area, including you, to check on their welfare and see if they need any assistance with home maintenance or other issues." Margaret felt a surge of excitement as she understood what Captain Morrison was really proposing. This would not be a confrontation or a threat, but simply a group of respectful military personnel paying a social visit to a fellow veteran. The fact that they would arrive on motorcycles and significantly outnumber the troublemakers across the street was merely a coincidence. "That sounds wonderful, Captain," Margaret replied. "I would be honored to receive a visit from your unit. What time should I expect you?" "We'll arrive around 2 o'clock in the afternoon," Captain Morrison said. "That seems to be when your neighborhood friends are most active, according to the reports I've received. We'll probably stay for about an hour, just long enough to make sure you're doing well, and to let the local community see some positive examples of military motorcycle riders." Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather for riding. Margaret spent the morning baking cookies and preparing iced tea for her expected guests. She also took extra care with her appearance, wearing a simple dress with a small pin that identified her as an Army veteran. She wanted to look dignified and proud when her military family arrived. Around noon, the familiar sound of motorcycle engines announced the arrival of the troublesome club members. Margaret watched from her window as they gathered in their usual spot, already drinking beer and playing loud music despite the early hour. They seemed particularly aggressive today, perhaps sensing that something was different in the neighborhood atmosphere. At exactly 2 o'clock, Margaret heard a new sound approaching from the distance. Unlike the rough, untuned engines of the club across the street, these motorcycles had the deep, powerful rumble of well-maintained machines operated by skilled riders. She stepped onto her front porch and smiled as she saw them coming down the street in perfect formation. 15 motorcycles rode in precise formation, each flying a small American flag from a mounted pole. The riders wore matching leather jackets with National Guard patches clearly visible, along with proper helmets and safety gear. They moved with military precision, maintaining exact spacing and following. Clear hand signals from their leader. The club members across the street stopped their conversation and stared as the National Guard unit pulled into Margaret's driveway and the adjacent street spaces. The contrast was striking. Where the club members looked rough and disorganized, these military riders appeared professional and disciplined. Their motorcycles were spotless, their gear was properly fitted, and their behavior was respectful and controlled. Captain Morrison removed her helmet and approached Margaret's porch with a warm smile. She was a woman in her 40s with short blonde hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. Behind her, the other riders were dismounting and organizing themselves with quiet efficiency. "Mrs. Thompson, it's an honor to meet you," the captain said, extending her hand. "My father sends his regards, and we're all grateful for the opportunity to visit with a distinguished veteran." The club members across the street had gone completely silent, watching with obvious confusion and growing unease. They had expected to continue their usual routine of harassment and intimidation, but instead found themselves outnumbered by what was clearly a superior force. More importantly, these were not random opponents but United States military personnel whose very presence commanded respect. Margaret invited Captain Morrison and several of the other riders onto her porch for refreshments, while the remaining Guard members positioned themselves casually around her property. They were not threatening or aggressive, simply present and visible. The message was clear without a single word being spoken. Margaret Thompson was not alone. and she was protected by people who understood the meaning of honor and service. As Margaret served cookies and iced tea to her guests, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had completely transformed. The National Guard members were genuinely interested in hearing about her military service, asking thoughtful questions about her experiences as an Army nurse, and sharing their own stories from recent deployments. Their conversation was animated but respectful, creating a stark contrast to the crude behavior that had become normal across the street. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan, examined Margaret's small garden with professional interest. "Ma'am, these roses are outstanding," he said admiringly. "My grandmother grew roses like these back in New Mexico. She always said they required patience and dedication to bloom properly." "Thank you, Sergeant," Margaret replied with genuine pleasure. "I've been working on this garden for nearly 30 years. My late husband Harold helped me plant the first bushes when we moved here." Across the street, the club members were having an increasingly uncomfortable conversation among themselves. Their leader, the same man who had thrown the beer can into Margaret's garden earlier that week, was clearly agitated by this unexpected development. Several of his followers kept glancing nervously at the uniformed soldiers and their impressive motorcycles. "What do you think they're doing here?" one of the younger club members asked quietly. "How should I know?" the leader snapped back. "Maybe the old lady called in some kind of favor, but they can't stay here forever." However, as the afternoon progressed, it became clear that the National Guard visit was more than just a brief social call. Captain Morrison had organized this as a comprehensive community outreach event, which meant they had legitimate reasons to remain in the area for several hours. They were conducting what she described as veteran welfare checks on several elderly former service members in the neighborhood. Specialist Jenkins, a young woman who had recently returned from deployment overseas, spent time helping Margaret organize her small storage shed. As they worked together, she casually mentioned that the National Guard unit often conducted weekend training exercises in the area, and that many of the members lived locally and rode their motorcycles regularly through the neighborhood. "We believe in being good neighbors," Specialist Jenkins explained as she moved some heavy boxes for Margaret. "Part of our mission is community relations, and that means making sure our fellow veterans feel safe and supported. We take that responsibility very seriously." The psychological impact on the club members was becoming increasingly obvious. What had started as their territory, where they felt free to behave however they pleased, had suddenly become a place where they were clearly outnumbered and outclassed. The National Guard members were not being confrontational, but their mere presence served as a powerful reminder that Margaret was not the isolated, defenseless target the club had assumed her to be. Around 4 o'clock, Captain Morrison gathered her unit for what she announced as a brief formation. The Guard members lined up in perfect military order while she addressed them in a voice loud enough to be clearly heard across the street. "Today's community outreach mission has been a complete success," she announced formally. "Mrs. Thompson represents the finest traditions of military service, and it's been an honor to spend time with her. I want to remind everyone that veteran welfare is one of our top priorities, and we will continue to maintain a presence in this area to ensure the safety and security of all retired service members." She paused and looked directly across the street before continuing. "We will be conducting regular training rides through this neighborhood from now on, particularly on weekend evenings when we're available for community service activities. I expect all unit members to maintain the highest standards of conduct and to report any issues that might affect the welfare of our veteran residents." The message was delivered in perfect military fashion, professional, clear, and unmistakably firm. While Captain Morrison had not directly threatened anyone or mentioned the club specifically, every person within hearing distance understood exactly what she was communicating. As the National Guard members prepared to leave, several of them made a point of exchanging contact information with Margaret. Sergeant Rodriguez gave her his personal phone number and told her to call him directly if she ever needed assistance with anything. Specialist Jenkins promised to stop by the following weekend to help with some yard work that Margaret had mentioned. "Mrs. Thompson, it's been a privilege meeting you," Captain Morrison said as she prepared to mount her motorcycle. "Please don't hesitate to contact me or any of my people if you need anything at all. We consider looking after our fellow veterans to be one of our most important duties." As the formation of motorcycles departed with the same precision with which they had arrived, Margaret stood on her porch waving goodbye. Across the street, the club members sat in uncomfortable silence, their earlier bravado completely deflated. The balance of power in the neighborhood had shifted dramatically, and everyone present understood that things would never be the same again. The change in Margaret's neighborhood was immediate and dramatic. That evening, for the first time in weeks, the motorcycle club gathered quietly across the street without their usual loud music and crude behavior. They spoke in hushed tones among themselves, frequently glancing toward Margaret's house with what appeared to be a mixture of confusion and newfound respect. The club's leader, who had been so aggressive and disrespectful just days earlier, seemed particularly subdued. He had clearly not expected the elderly woman across the street to have connections to active military personnel, and the professional display he had witnessed that afternoon had obviously made a strong impression on him. Margaret enjoyed the most peaceful evening she had experienced in over a month. She was able to water her garden without harassment, check her mailbox without crude comments, and sit on her front porch reading without the constant noise that had been disrupting her quiet retirement. More importantly, she felt a sense of pride and vindication that reminded her of her best days in military service. Sunday morning brought an unexpected development that surprised everyone in the neighborhood. Around 10 o'clock, Margaret heard a tentative knock on her front door. When she opened it, she found the club leader standing on her porch looking uncomfortable but determined. He had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this conversation. "Ma'am, my name is Danny Martinez," he said, removing his baseball cap and holding it nervously in his hands. "I wanted to apologize for my behavior and the behavior of my friends. We were wrong to treat you the way we did, and I'm sorry." Margaret studied him carefully, noting the genuine remorse in his voice and the respectful way he was conducting himself. This was clearly not the same arrogant young man who had been harassing her just a week earlier. "I appreciate your apology, Danny," she replied calmly. "Would you like to sit down and talk about what happened?" They sat on Margaret's front porch while Danny explained that he and several of his club members were actually veterans themselves, having served in Iraq and Afghanistan before struggling to readjust to civilian life. The motorcycle club had been their way of finding brotherhood and purpose after leaving the military, but they had gradually developed bad habits and lost sight of the values they had once sworn to uphold. "When those guard members showed up yesterday, it reminded me of who I used to be," Danny admitted. "Seeing them treat you with respect and hearing them talk about taking care of fellow veterans made me realize how far off track we've gotten. We forgot that you served too, and that you deserve better from us." Margaret listened thoughtfully as Danny continued to explain how the encounter with Captain Morrison's unit had affected his entire group. Several of the club members had approached him after the guard members left, expressing shame about their recent behavior and asking what they should do to make things right. "We'd like to make amends if you'll let us," Danny said. "Some of the guys noticed that your fence needs some repairs and your driveway could use some work. We'd like to help fix those things if you're willing to accept our help." Over the following weeks, Margaret witnessed a remarkable transformation in her neighborhood. The motorcycle club members began arriving earlier in the evenings and leaving much sooner. They kept their music at reasonable volumes and cleaned up after themselves. More significantly, they started helping elderly residents throughout the area with various home maintenance tasks. Danny and 2 other club members spent an entire Saturday repairing Margaret's fence and resurface her driveway. They worked quietly and efficiently, refusing to accept any payment beyond the sandwiches and lemonade she provided. Their workmanship was excellent, and they treated her property with the same care they would show their own homes. The transformation extended beyond just improved behavior. Danny began visiting Margaret regularly, not as a troublemaker but as a neighbor who valued her wisdom and experience. She learned that he was struggling with some of the same challenges that many veterans face when transitioning back to civilian life, and she was able to share insights from her own experience and connect him with veteran support services. 3 months later, Margaret received another phone call from Captain Morrison, who had heard reports about the positive changes in the neighborhood. The captain was so impressed with the story that she arranged for Danny and several of his club members to participate in a Veterans Day ceremony at the National Guard base, where they were recognized for their community service efforts. Margaret stood in her garden on a beautiful autumn morning, tending to her roses and reflecting on the events of the past few months. The neighborhood was peaceful again, but more than that, It had become a place where veterans of different generations looked out for each other. Her simple phone call to an old military friend had not only solved her immediate problem but had helped other veterans find their way back to the values they had once served to protect. As she worked among her flowers, Margaret could hear the distant sound of motorcycles approaching. But now, instead of feeling anxiety, she felt anticipation. Danny had promised to stop by that morning to help her plant some new rose bushes, and she looked forward to continuing their conversations about service, honor, and the importance of treating others with respect. The military had taught Margaret many valuable lessons during her 25 years of service, but perhaps none more important than this. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to remember that you're never really alone, and that the bonds forged through service and sacrifice can provide strength and support long after the uniform comes off.